Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of short videos looking at key concepts and issues in international politics. In this video, we'll examine the liberal international order. Specifically, we'll define the contours of the liberal international order and examine the central principles and norms that it encompasses. We'll also look at the institutional arrangements that support and maintain that order, and we'll consider some of the debates around its collapse. So there's a lot to cover. Let's get to it. At the end of World War II, the Allied powers created a new international system with the goal of rebuilding the global economy and preventing future international conflicts. Their shared belief was that only a strong set of global institutional arrangements shaping relations between states could prevent the world from slipping into another global war. Remember that at the time, the world had just recovered from two massive conflicts in a period of less than 30 years. World War I, which lasted from 1914 to 1919, and World War II, which lasted from 1939 to 1945. The central dilemma then was how to prevent another global war. But what exactly was this liberal international order they constructed? The Liberal International Order, or LIO, is often described as an open and rules-based system that is enshrined in the various international institutions like the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, or the World Trade Organization, with its roots usually traced to the end of World War II. But let's break that down a little bit more, and let's start with what we mean by order. Lake, Martin, and Rees define order as patterned or structured relationships among units. These patterns and structured relationships are conditioned both on the material and ideational structures. That is, orders are rooted in the specific material conditions and institutions, the organizations that set rules governing the behaviors of actors within the order, for example. But they also have an ideational component, based on a shared understanding that gives rise to shared norms, expectations, and behaviors. Such norms, expectations, and behaviors are frequently operationalized through rules, institutions, and laws, suggesting that there is a reciprocal and mutually reinforcing relationship between the two. That is to say, the institutional structures that define the LIO help create the rules and norms which inform the behavior of actors within the system, which in turn serve to legitimate the institutions themselves. So if the concept of order encompasses the institutional and normative expectations structuring relations between actors within the system, by international, we're simply referring to relations between actors at a level beyond the state. Now, that's not to say that subnational actors are not influenced or impacted by the LIO, only that they are not the primary agents within the international system. Those are generally viewed as states. And finally, what do we mean by liberal in this context? This is probably the most challenging component to understand of the LIO, but it's also the most critical because liberalism is obviously the defining feature of the liberal international order. Here, liberalism has three overlapping, reinforcing, even if sometimes contradictory elements. First, we can think of political liberalism, that is, the support for democracy and human rights and in opposition to authoritarianism. Second, we include economic liberalism, or broadly free market-oriented economic systems in opposition to economic nationalism or mercantilism. And third, we mean liberal institutionalism. That is, the reliance on international organizations to structure relations and hopefully at least to maintain peaceful relations between states. And so, taken together, the liberal international order is an open and rules-based system rooted in a shared understanding of liberal democratic international political economy and structured through institutions and norms at the global level. Most scholars argue that the roots of the liberal international order can be traced to the end of World War II, when the various institutional structures of the system were founded. From this perspective, perhaps the seminal event in the creation of the liberal international order was the Atlantic Charter, a joint declaration issued by U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in August of 1941. The Atlantic Charter outlined the central tenets of the post-war international political economy from the American and British perspective, and included provisions that would later be operationalized through the creation of a new set of global institutions after the end of the war. The central provisions of the Atlantic Charter included peace and security, including the right to national self-defense and the preservation of the territorial status quo, the right to national self-determination, including self-rule, open societies, and the maintenance of the rule of law, economic prosperity achieved through economic growth, improved labor standards, and domestic social welfare protections, free trade, and the protection of the global commons. But the exact moment of the founding of the liberal international order is contested. Some scholars, like John Eikenberry, trace the roots of the liberal international order back further in history. Eikenberry asserts that the historical roots of the LIO are found in two places: the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, which essentially marked the beginning of the modern state system, and the periods of Pax Britannica in the 19th century and Pax Americana in the 20th century, which witnessed the rise and expansion of liberal democracy. Others, like John Mearsheimer, contend that the liberal international order really only took shape after the end of the Cold War, when the communist alternative posed by the Soviet Union disappeared and liberal democracy remained effectively the only legitimate and viable political system. Interestingly, one of the primary points of contention between the two approaches centers on how the liberal international order has to be understood as an international order. That is, how many countries need to be part of an order before it can be said to be international or global. The Atlantic Charter was a statement issued by just 2 countries. The United Nations was founded by just 51, and the principles articulated in the UN Charter were primarily Westphalian rather than liberal in orientation. That is to say, the UN Charter concerns itself far more with the protection of the sovereignty of its member states than it does with the broader liberal concerns over democracy, free trade, and the protection of human rights. And the creation of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund did broaden membership in the liberal international order, but these institutions, even while having broader membership, maintain power structures through voting systems and quotas that disproportionately reflect the interests and the worldviews of the dominant powers. At a minimum, it is clear that the liberal international order reached its zenith in the early 1990s with the creation of the International Criminal Court, the adoption of the responsibility to protect doctrine by the United Nations, and the dramatic expansion and focus on democratization and humanitarian intervention. We can think of the liberal international order as being comprised of 3 distinct but overlapping elements. The first is the security order. In its simplest terms, the security order is comprised of the institutional arrangements, norms, and expectations that condition or constrain state behavior in the international system. Contrary to the assertion that states do whatever is in their interest in the pursuit of power, adherents of the liberal international order assert that the behavior of states is limited or constrained in particular ways. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, for example, defines international law governing maritime disputes and outlines certain norms of state behavior in this area. And states generally operate according to those rules, as the international system increases the cost of behaving in ways that run counter to it. We can trace the evolution of the security order through 3 broad phases. During the early Cold War period, the international system was structured on an agreement reached by the Allied powers at the Yalta Conference. That agreement was largely rooted in Westphalian understandings of sovereignty. By the mid-1970s, broad international agreement, at least within the context of Europe, was being reached that the territorial borders of the state were supposed to be inviolable. The understanding was most clearly codified in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the OSCE, which became a central forum to facilitate negotiation and reduce tensions between the Soviet and American blocs during the Cold War. And finally, after the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, the security order was expanded to embrace democratization. Perhaps the clearest example of this was the Paris Charter for a New Europe, an agreement concluded at the November 1990 Paris Heads of State meeting of the OSCE. Under the Paris Charter, the OSCE member states, which remember included Russia, established democracy as the only system of government for our nations. In addition to the security order, we can also identify an economic order central to the liberal international system. This economic order was rooted in classical and neoclassical economics, the principle of comparative advantage, and the idea that trade and specialization benefits all parties, the idea that breaking down barriers to the free flow of goods, services, capital, and knowledge, and ultimately perhaps even people, would lead to greater efficiency and productivity, thereby promoting economic growth and development. Like the security order, the economic order evolved over time. Its roots rested in the period of Pax Britannica and the promotion of free trade in the 19th century. But the first real operationalization of the idea in the post-war era was the creation of the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, or the GATT, in 1947. The GATT committed its members to converting non-tariff barriers to tariffs and then to reducing tariffs in order to promote international trade. Until the early 1970s, the GATT system promoted liberalization of trade at the international level, but rested on an uneasy compromise promoting free trade between countries while maintaining extensive social protections domestically, a compromise often referred to as embedded liberalism. By the late 1970s, the compromise of embedded liberalism began to be dismantled. The social protections and safety nets afforded people by the state at the domestic level were reduced, and in some cases eliminated in the name of efficiency and competition. This is the idea of structural adjustment and neoliberalism. That movement, which Danny Roderick refers to as hyperglobalization, was symbolized most dramatically by the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995 and the extension of WTO membership to China in 2001 and to Russia in 2012. Finally, the liberal international order also includes a human rights order that is rooted most clearly in the UN Charter, which reaffirmed faith in fundamental human rights and dignity and worth of the human person, and committed all UN member states to promoting universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Adopted by the United Nations in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights went even further. The Declaration included 30 articles detailing the basic rights and fundamental freedoms of all persons, including civil and political rights like the right to life, liberty, free speech, and privacy, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights like the right to social security, health, and education. During the Cold War, the debate between the United States and the Soviet Union often paralyzed progress in guaranteeing a broad set of human rights. But after the Cold War, the human rights order was expanded and strengthened, most notably through three broad developments. First, the creation of the International Criminal Court for the first time established an institutional framework for protecting human rights beyond the nation state. Specifically, the ICC was created to prosecute individuals for crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes in cases where the state was unwilling or unable to do so. Second, the articulation of the Responsibility to Protect, or R2P doctrine by the United Nations in 2005 established the principle that the international community bore a collective responsibility to respond to and prevent acts of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. The R2P doctrine represented a dramatic abrogation of the traditional view of sovereignty and the principle of domestic non-intervention, committing the United Nations and its member states, at least in principle, to acting to prevent mass atrocity crimes and human rights violations. Third, the principle of liberal interventionism became more widely employed as the United States and its allies increasingly intervened to effect political change abroad, not just out of immediate self-interest, but under a broader belief that democratization in and of itself should be a goal of U.S. foreign policy. And as previously said, these three elements of the liberal international order were institutionalized through institutions like the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in the Security Order, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and World Trade Organization in the Economic Order, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the International Criminal Court in the Human Rights Order. In recent years, the liberal international order has come under increasing criticism and attack, both from within and without, and the order itself contains some contradictory elements being perceived in different ways by different actors in the international system. Think, for example, about the willingness of the United States and others to use force to promote democratization and human rights. It seems clear that this principle has been applied unevenly at best. The responsibility to protect, for example, has been applied in some cases, like Libya, while it's not been applied in others, like Syria. Similarly, the willingness of NATO to use force in Syria in 1999 without securing a legal mandate from the United Nations Security Council for such action was widely condemned by countries outside of the West. And similarly, when the United States declared war in an effort to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq in 2003 without UN Security Council authorization, the United States was also criticized by a number of countries around the world, as this action was viewed as a violation of the liberal international order and of international law. In the eyes of its critics, the uneven application of the central pillars of the liberal international order reinforced the hypocrisy of the order itself. From their perspective, such actions demonstrated that Western powers were willing to operate in violation of the central principles of the order when they believed there was a clear or compelling reason to do so. The rise of populist movements and increasing economic protectionism in a number of countries also represents a significant challenge to the liberal international order. One element key to the liberal international order was that disputes over the rules of the order could be resolved peacefully through institutional frameworks, thereby preventing military conflict. Organizations like the UN Security Council, the Dispute Settlement Mechanism in the World Trade Organization, and the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court were all developed to provide a way to peacefully resolve disputes between states. But states are increasingly withdrawing from those arrangements. The World Trade Organization's dispute settlement mechanism was effectively sidelined by the U.S. refusal to permit new judges to be appointed to the organization. As a result, by 2020, the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism could no longer hear cases. And Brexit, the UK's exit from the European Union, similarly signaled a weakening of the liberal international order, as did the US withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the increasing trade disputes between the United States and a number of other countries, including not just China, but also Canada over timber, the European Union over aircraft, genetically modified foods, and a host of other items, and other countries, all point to a rise in protectionism and a weakening of the liberal economic order. The rise of China, and to a lesser extent perhaps Russia, presents an alternative vision of the international order. China's trajectory combined an authoritarian political order with an economic system that drew on the openness of the international economic order. And China has been clear in its desire to restructure the international system away from one that favored the United States to one that favors China. The One Belt, One Road initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank can both be viewed in this context as an effort by China to expand its reach and influence. And China's successful and rapid economic development provides a normative framework to support its policies, particularly in the eyes of the developing world. Russia's goals seem less focused on creating an alternative order than on weakening the existing liberal international order. Russia's support for far-right nationalist and populist parties across Europe, its willingness to use force in the pursuit of interests abroad, and its efforts to undermine the functioning of democratic institutions in the United States, France, and elsewhere all provide examples of this. And finally, the U.S. retreat from its position of leadership creates an opportunity for those alternative orders envisioned by China, Russia, and others to take hold, while simultaneously undermining support for the liberal international order among American allies. The liberal international order was in many ways rooted in American hegemony. It depended on the United States' willingness to bear the costs of maintaining that order, and it disproportionately benefited the United States economically and politically. But the U.S. appears increasingly unwilling to pay that cost, and as a result, it may lose those benefits. President Trump's America First platform was perhaps the most dramatic signal of this tendency, but a case could be made that the withdrawal of U.S. leadership predated Trump. In the eyes of American allies and opponents, President Trump's apparent willingness to abandon long-standing U.S. commitments and security guarantees to NATO and Asian allies and others, his embrace of protectionist trade measures, and the symbolic abandonment of U.S. commitment to free trade, the U.S. withdrawal from leadership positions and indeed even membership in key international organizations, and a host of other measures all raised questions as to whether or not the U.S. could be relied on to support its allies and honor its commitments in times of a challenge. And no other country appears to be in the position to assume leadership of the liberal international order. The European Union remains focused on internal questions arising from the Brexit crisis and the migration crisis, and China would prefer to see an alternative to the liberal international order. No other country appears to be willing or able to replace waning American leadership. The political and economic system that was the liberal international order was led primarily by the United States and was at the heart of the global political economy from 1945 through the 1990s. That system is credited with promoting the economic reconstruction and development of Europe, of preventing recurrence of a whole-scale global conflict, and facilitated rapid technological innovation, development, and reduced poverty worldwide. But the liberal international order now appears to be in crisis, and its future is in doubt. What do you think? Is the liberal international order in collapse? If so, what might replace it? And should we be concerned about this, or is it a positive development in global politics? Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.